So welcome everybody to Strait Science. We are doing something completely different here, and that is we are beaming this Strait Science in via satellite from the Sikuliaq, the research vessel Sikuliaq that is operated by the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And currently the ship is near the Shumagon Islands, so that's in the northern Gulf of Alaska, heading for home, which will be Seward, Alaska. So they've already passed through the strait, but they've been up here, and we're going to hear the interesting work that Dr. Robert Mason is doing on Sikuliaq. And his topic will be near and dear to us because he's going to be talking about methylmercury, not a topic that we normally talk about because of the subsistence nature of this region, and that primarily foods are harvested off the land and in the water. This will be of great interest. Dr. Robert Mason is a professor. He's with the Department of Marine Sciences at the University of Connecticut. And if something were to happen with this connection, I will still be live and we'll try to have them call back in. And with that, we'll have questions at the end. And again, utilize your chat box. Take it away, Dr. Mason. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gay, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you today and share some of my research that I've been doing. As Gay said, we're focusing on mercury and the impacts of climate change on mercury inputs to the Arctic Ocean and how that may affect concentrations of mercury and methylmercury in fish. And of course, the main concern is that both the fish and marine mammals are consumed by humans. And this is methylmercury can be built up to high enough levels in the biota that are consumed that are the health risk to the humans and also a health risk to wildlife. While the focus on the ship is mercury, we do have other researchers on board, and one group of them, Mark Stevens and Doug Hammond, are here to measure radio traces, radon and radium in the water, and because that will help us understand what's going on with the mercury, as I'll tell you in a moment. Laurie Juranek from Oregon State University is here measuring primary productivity using oxygen and argon gases and isotopes. And another colleague from the University of Connecticut, Penny Vlahos, is here studying inorganic carbon, and she's also collecting samples for measuring organic contaminants in the air and the water. So we have a wonderful group of people on the ship, and we've been having great science. So I'm not sure how much everyone knows about mercury. So Ethan, the slide is not forwarding. Oh, there we go. All right. So I just wanted to give a brief introduction. There are 4 types of mercury that exist in the, I mean, we talk about mercury and we don't know all the different types of mercury. Elemental mercury is, of course, what the liquid that was put into mercury thermometers and other uses. It can, as it's a liquid, it can be a gas in the air, and it's a gas in the atmosphere around us, and it can be dissolved as a gas in the water. So in the same way that CO2 can be in the atmosphere and in the ocean, the same with mercury. And throughout the talk, I'll refer to this as Hg0 or elemental mercury. Mercury can also be in an ionic form. And this is the form that is the highest concentration. Most of the mercury in the atmosphere or in the water is in this oxidized form, and it's dissolved in the water and is highly soluble. And I will call this Hg2 throughout the talk to distinguish between the form that's of concern for human and mammal health, right, is methylmercury. This is an organic compound of mercury, bioaccumulates very highly, and then what that means is it increases in concentration at each trophic level. So the higher you are up in the food chain, the higher your concentration. So if you are eating fish, then you have a high concentration. If you're eating something higher in the food chain, like marine mammals, your exposure could be even higher. There's another form of organic mercury in the environment called dimethylmercury. This is a volatile and unstable form, and it normally degrades to methylmercury, so it's a source of methylmercury in the ocean, and that is why we study it as well. So these 4 forms of mercury are being measured in both the water, the ice, and in the atmosphere during the cruises, right? And historically, mercury was used for lots of things, but a lot of those uses have now been banned. And currently, the major sources of mercury to the environment are coal burning and the use of mercury in gold extraction, and mostly by small-scale miners in developing countries. And so one of the things about the Arctic is that a very small fraction of the mercury that is coming into the Arctic Ocean came from anthropogenic sources in the Arctic. Most of it has come from somewhere else. So mercury is coming from emissions in other parts of the world and being deposited. And the reason it can is that it exists in the atmosphere for 6 to 12 months before it is deposited back to the earth. So it can be transported widely around the globe. In the atmosphere, most of the mercury is elemental mercury, as it's a gas, as I said, but it can be converted into the oxidized form, the Hg2, and this can be present both as a gas or attached to particles as aerosols. And we are measuring all these 3 forms in the atmosphere during the cruise. And one of the focuses and one of the reasons we are out here right now is that during the Arctic spring period, we have lots of atmospheric chemical reactions that enhance the conversion of the elemental Hg0 to the oxidized mercury, and what we call reactive gaseous mercury. And this is very soluble and deposits to the ocean and accumulates in the water, right? So this is very important for inputs of mercury to the Arctic. In water, snow, and ice, we are looking at the concentrations of the Hg2, the methylmercury, and the dimethylmercury in the water. And this is to help us understand the interconversion. Each form of mercury can be formed from one other form, or it can be decomposed back into another form. So there's a very complicated chemistry going on in the water, and then we're trying to understand that better to understand how that affects the methylmercury concentration and therefore the concentrations in the organism. And we also are collecting samples in the sediments because while in most of the ocean, the sediments are not that important because the shelf environment is a small part of the total ocean. In the Arctic, there's a lot of shelf environment, a lot of shallow waters, and the sediments are a very important part of the whole story. So as I said earlier, we are measuring radon on this cruise. Radon is a gas that is formed by radioactive decay of radium. This is a process that's occurring naturally in the water, but the radon as a gas can be lost to the atmosphere. And if we can measure the concentrations in the water column, then we can understand the rate at which radon and mercury as well, elemental mercury, because they have a similar mass. It tells us about the loss of elemental mercury from the water to the atmosphere. And you can see on this figure on the left-hand side of the screen, right? You can see the dotted line is the expected concentration of radon in the water. And you can see in the top 10 meters, the radon has been decreased, and this is because it's been lost by gas exchange. So this is very useful in helping us understand what's going on with the mercury. On the right-hand side, the picture on the top shows an experiment done many years ago showing that we could do experiments in the lab and calculate the rate at which radon and mercury were being lost from the water under different conditions. And as I said, because they have a similar mass, they should have been lost at the same time. And so the ratio between their rate of exchange should have been close to 1, but we found that the ratio was much higher. Radon was being lost much more readily than mercury, and this is because mercury is being formed by many more reactions in the water than the radon is, and so comparing the mercury and the radon helps us understand what's going on with the mercury. And I won't talk very much more about radon for the rest of the talk, but this is really a key part of helping us understand what's going on with the mercury. So here's some pictures from the ship. On the top left are atmospheric samplers. So we collecting particles in the air, we're collecting rainwater, although it hasn't rained very much during the cruise, and we are also measuring the different forms of mercury in the atmosphere using the instrument in the middle. And then on the bottom are pictures of us coring through the ice to collect an ice core and collecting other samples on the ice. And two of the students involved in the mercury research are shown on this figure. And here is pictures of the devices we use. On the left, bottom left, is the rosette we use to collect the water samples. The top left is a picture of the actual containers that we collect the water in. And then on the right-hand side are pictures of us, the device, the multi-corer we use to collect the sediments. And then once the sediments are on the deck, we slice them up into intervals so we can then get the history of the mercury concentrations in the sediments, because as the sediments being deposited over time, it's a historical record. So we will be able to use that when we make the measurements back in the lab to reconstruct the concentrations of mercury and how they have changed over time, which is a very important part of the story. This is a figure of the cycling of mercury globally in the between the atmosphere and the ocean and the terrestrial environment. And I just want to focus on the ocean here and show the contrast between the ocean generally and the Arctic Ocean. So a few things about this figure. You can see the deposition. So the mercury is coming out of the atmosphere in rain and through particles into the surface ocean. And that's the main source of mercury to the global ocean compared to the rivers. If you do the calculation of the two numbers, the ratio is about almost 10-to-1 times more mercury is coming in from the atmosphere than is coming in from rivers. And the main sink of mercury, the main loss of mercury, is actually back to the atmosphere. Mercury gets converted into Hg0 in the surface ocean by biological and chemical reactions, and then it is lost back to the atmosphere in the same way that CO2 is exchanged between the ocean and the atmosphere. So is mercury. So mercury is a very interesting metal in that, because it is a liquid at room temperature, it's dissolved as a gas in the water. That's very different from all the other metals, and therefore it has this ocean atmosphere exchange is a very important part of the cycle. So just to compare that with what we have in the Arctic, and something happened to my figure here. It's all got squashed, I'm sorry to say, but basically, if we do the same comparisons between the amount of mercury coming from the atmosphere to the Arctic compared to the amount of mercury coming in from the terrestrial environment, the ratio is somewhat less than 1. So the terrestrial environment is so much more important as a source of mercury to the Arctic Ocean than it is to the oceans in general. And this is because of large inputs of mercury in the rivers, especially the rivers from Russia. There's inputs from snow and ice melt, and from glaciers and other coastal erosion, and lots of other inputs. So the Arctic Ocean is very different from the other oceans of the world in that it has this very, very strong connection with the terrestrial environment. And this is one of the main impacts of climate change, is that in the same way that there's a concern about permafrost and the unfreezing of permafrost in terms of releasing CO2 to the atmosphere and to the environment, permafrost melting is going to be a big source of mercury as well. There's lots of mercury tied up in the terrestrial environment in the soils, and so it's a big important part of the carbon cycle, and it's a very important part of the mercury cycle as well. So all the climate change impacts that are impacting carbon are also going to have a big impact on mercury as well. So that's one of the focuses of a lot of people studying the terrestrial environment, not what I am doing, but it's a very important part of the story. So this figure shows in a historical context using teeth and other feathers and hair from polar bears from historical archives. You can measure the concentration of mercury and reconstruct how it has changed over time. And so this figure is a little old, right? It went to 2000, but you can see that there's a dramatic increase in the amount of mercury in these archives since the middle of the 19th century, from 1850 onwards. And so this is a strong indication of the role of human and climate change in increasing the amount of mercury that's being put into the Arctic. This is a figure from a recent report that has been come out, and if anyone is interested, I mean, I could send or give you a link to the copy. This is an AMAP, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program has just come out with a new mercury report in 2021. It's just been released, and what it's showing here is concentrations of methylmercury in polar bears around the Arctic. And of course, where we are is up at the top of this figure, right? You can see Alaska on the top left of the Bering Strait, right? And looking at the figure, the color scheme is going from no effect to low risk to moderate risk and high risk. And so you can see for polar bears, for various reasons, this is a health risk from methylmercury exposure to polar bears in the Canadian Arctic to a larger degree than elsewhere in the Arctic. And this has been seen not just only with polar bears, but within birds and marine mammals. And so one of the biggest questions is trying to understand why there are these big differences in the amounts of methylmercury in the food of polar bears and other marine mammals. If you look at the concentration of mercury in organisms in the marine environment, and this is for the Arctic, what's on this figure is a plot of the concentration of mercury, and I should point out that this is a log plot, right? So it's increasing by a factor of 10 for each point on this figure, and the x-axis is a measure of where the organism is in the food chain, in other words, what it is eating. And so you're going from plankton on the bottom left all the way up to beluga whales on the right hand top right, and you can see that as you go up the food chain, the concentration increases, so that the concentration of the beluga whales is at least 100 times higher than it is in the plankton and the other organisms at the base of the food chain. So the higher you are in the food chain, the higher your mercury concentration. And this is both due to what you're eating, but also your age. So the concentration tends to increase with age. So if you're a larger, long-lived organism, you're going to have a higher concentration, and over your lifetime, your concentration is going to increase. I'm just quickly going to report about a study done by colleagues at the University of Connecticut three or 4 years ago. They were out here in the, and you can see on the right-hand side, the dots on the figure near the Aleutian Islands were the stations that they sampled. So they sampled various stations, and in fact, we revisited one of these stations on the ship yesterday because, as you can see in the figure on the two figures on the bottom, there are very high concentrations of methylmercury at the bottom waters at the station, And the previous study had only collected one sample in the deep waters, and we wanted to come back and make sure that this trend that we see is true. And so we now have more data that will help us with, but you can see that the concentrations vary going into the deeper water and offshore at these sites. And if we look at the concentrations in the particles, which are mostly phytoplankton, those are the two figures on the left-hand side in June and September, and then in copepods, which are zooplankton, again in June and September, you can see the highest concentrations of methyl. These are methylmercury concentrations in these organisms are at the place where we saw the highest concentrations in the bottom water in the previous figure. And so there's been a question about whether or not how the high concentrations in the bottom water would get into the organisms, that mostly in the surface water, but we were actually able to make measurements we're making measurements in the surface water on this cruise and measuring the dimethylmercury concentration, which is something that we can do at sea. And we found high concentrations of dimethylmercury in the surface waters yesterday at these locations. And they were the highest dimethylmercury concentrations that we've seen on the whole cruise so far. And so the higher concentrations in these organisms is directly related to the fact that this methylmercury that's accumulating deep in the water column is getting mixed up to the surface, and it has to do with the physical chemistry of the environment, which we'll have to sort out. But so this is another evidence of high concentrations of methylmercury in the food chain in this part of the world. And they also collected data on pollock during the cruise, and this shows again that the concentration of mercury shown here is total mercury, but in most of the methylmercury in the fish, most of the total mercury in the fish is methylmercury. You can see as the fish gets bigger, it has a higher concentration, although there is quite a lot of scatter in the data. And then on the bottom is the same figure that I showed before, but the axes are flipped, I'm sorry to say. So in this figure, the y-axis is where the organisms are in the food chain, and the x-axis is the methylmercury concentration. And again, you can see that the pollock have higher concentrations than the plankton, which is what you would expect. Yeah, and the larger fish have higher concentrations than the smaller fish, right? So this is just going back and showing a figure to reset our ideas about, all the complexities of mercury getting into and out of where it comes from and where it goes from in the Arctic. And I'm just going to skip over to this and not get into too much detail, but mercury can come into the Arctic from rivers and from other terrestrial sources. There's exchange between the atmosphere, and the exchange with the atmosphere and the surface ocean is one big focus on the research cruise that I am currently doing. And so I'm going to move on and talk more about our current research. One of the big aspects in terms of the Arctic Ocean itself is the amount of sea ice. One of the biggest factors, this figure here again is from the AMAP report, and one of the biggest factors in terms of how much methylmercury there is, how much mercury is coming in from the atmosphere, all has to do with the amount of sea ice, because the sea ice has a large role to play in the chemistry that occurs in the atmosphere just above the sea ice, and it also has an impact on the rate of the reactions that are occurring in the surface water that can change the mercury from the different forms and actually can be involved in the degradation of methylmercury. And so breakdown of methylmercury, sunlight will break down methylmercury. So more or less sea ice, there's a big debate going on in the mercury community about that, whether or not less sea ice will lead to more mercury in the fish or less sea ice will lead to less mercury in the fish. And so this is one of the aspects of research that I've been focusing on. In terms of mercury coming into the Arctic, this is a modeling study. Again, and I put the circle up here at the top on the left, showing where we are right now in terms of the Arctic map, right? And so what these modelers did, they modeled how much of the changes that they saw between 2010 and 2015 came from changes in the amount of mercury getting transported to the Arctic due to releases of mercury in other parts of the world, anthropogenic increases, and how much of it had to do with aspects related to climate change. And you can see in this figure on the left at the top, there's a large either positive or negative impact of climate related impacts, which is much bigger than the relative change due to changes of mercury inputs to the global atmosphere. So really climate is a very big story here in terms of the impacts in the future on the Arctic. All right, so I'm just going to, before I talk about the work we've been doing right now, I just want to summarize here some of the key findings of the AMAP report that just came out. I was actually involved in writing some of this, right? And we, as I said before, most of the mercury coming into the Arctic comes from somewhere else. It's not generated in the Arctic. People in the Arctic are one of the most exposed populations globally to mercury impacts. And then this is true for both humans and wildlife. And new research has increased our understanding, as I said, but this is certainly an ongoing process, and the effects of climate are very important. But modeling suggests that if we took strong action right now, we would be able to mitigate these controls. And there is an international convention called the Minamata Convention on Mercury through the United Nations. And of course, all our assessments will help understand. And the Minamata Convention is aimed at trying to reduce mercury inputs to the global atmosphere. And the Mercury Assessment Report talks a lot about the role of indigenous people in helping research and developing global agreements on mercury and other contaminants in the Arctic. So the research questions for the study and what for the current study is how is sea ice impacting the input of mercury from the atmosphere? How does the extent of sea ice impact reactions that are occurring in the water, and how does this affect the amount of methylmercury in the water, and will this change the amount of methylmercury accumulating into fish, right? And so again, the study that I'm doing right now is looking at exchange and the shelf sediments between the sediments and the water column. We're looking at exchange between the atmosphere and the surface ocean, and then we also trying to understand the role of ice and of ice melting and contributing mercury into the Arctic. So I'm just going to focus a little bit on this for the rest of the talk. This figure, and sorry, it's a little out of focus, shows the concentrations of mercury measured on previous cruises in the Arctic. And you can see that there are very high concentration, much higher concentrations in the surface ocean of the Arctic and on the shelf than in the deeper waters. And this is why there is a larger impact. A lot of the other oceans of the world, the higher concentrations are deeper in the water column, and they are lower in the surface. So again, this is because of the strong terrestrial input and the impact of sea ice in the Arctic. So we have much higher concentrations in the surface. And this is, of course, where most of the organisms reside. And so therefore why we're having higher concentrations in the food chain in the Arctic. Previous studies, one of the things that we're doing are measuring the concentration of HG0 in the surface water. As I said, mercury can be lost back to the atmosphere as a gas. And so we're measuring this Hg0 in the surface water. And we can do that continuously using, as the ship is moving, we continuously sampling the water. And these are two previous studies that were done showing, and in both of these figures, the shaded area is where the sea ice was. One was in July and September in 2005. One was in August to October in 2015. Of course, there was more ice around, but because it was earlier in the season in 2005 and because it was 15 years ago, right? And so the sea ice extent has changed quite dramatically. But you can see in 2005, there were higher concentrations than we found in 2015. And so we don't know whether this is just seasonal variability between year and year, or whether there are actually lower concentrations now than there were before. And so one of the reasons is we were here now is to try and get further information on the concentrations in the surface water. The other thing in the atmosphere, as I mentioned before, is that in the spring you get these reactions occurring in association with ice, and also on the shore when there's still snow on the land. And it's a reaction where the elemental mercury, which is shown in the dark blue in this figure, it gets converted into these reactive mercury, which is shown in this figure as RGM is the reactive gaseous mercury, and PHG is the particulate mercury. So we have this chemistry going on. It's the same chemistry that destroys ozone in the Arctic in the spring. And the reactive gaseous mercury, the green and the pink, are much more soluble and much more readily deposited. So you have these high inputs of mercury into the Arctic in the spring. Most of the measurements to date have been done on land, and so one of the things is to try and see if we can make the similar measurements in sea ice out in the ocean. So just a quick primer on this. This is complicated chemistry, and even I struggle a little bit to understand it. But the bromine atoms, which are formed by chemical reactions in the atmosphere, will react with the Hg0 and form oxidized mercury. And these reactions, they need the bromide ions, which comes from seawater or from brine in the snowpack or from sea salt aerosols. So this is a strong connection with the sea ice. You don't get these reactions away from the coastline in the interior of the Arctic. Because there's no bromide to initiate these reactions, and we don't find these reactions in old multi-year ice because the surface of the ice no longer has high concentrations of bromide, which would stimulate these reactions. So really, one of the focuses of the study was to look at the ice edge and see how these reactions and the chemistry changes as we go in and out of the ice. This is just a quick figure. I know there's a lot of information in this figure, and this is recently people have actually been able to measure the bromide in the atmosphere. Before, people weren't able to do it. If you look at the figure, which says the radiation on the axis here, you can see this is in March, close to Barrow in Alaska, that the study was done, right? And you can see the daily radiation. So this is not full sunlight for 24 hours, but and you can see that the concentrations of the bromide increase during the day and go down during the night. And you can also see here on the bottom figure, we're getting decreases in elemental mercury and increases in the reactive gaseous mercury when we have the high bromide concentration. So that this is showing the direct link between the bromide and the mercury chemistry. And this is a study that was published recently. And so this is very exciting, showing that our ideas of how this chemistry occurs are are real. Yeah, in terms of mercury in the ice, this is concentrations of mercury and methylmercury in sea ice cores that were collected in 2015. And again, I just show these to show I don't have any data from the sea ice we collected on this cruise yet, but this is what we may expect to find higher concentrations of mercury in the surface. And there's also methylmercury in the ice, and the methylmercury in the ice can be formed by microorganisms that are present in the ice. And typically we find higher concentrations and then near the surface of the ice and lower concentrations in depth. And the concentrations in the ice are similar to the concentrations we find in precipitation and in snow. So we'll have some data like this from the study once we get back to Connecticut, and we can then analyze the ice cores that we have collected. So this is a picture of the cruise track. We started in Dutch Harbor. This figure is a few days old. So we went up and through the Bering Strait and then to the Chukchi Sea, and we went as far as we could. And we got into the ice as far as we could with the ship. And then we are currently on our way back down, and we passed through the Aleutians, and we're heading back to Seward right now. So this is just one figure showing where we were, one figure of the ice edge and the cruise track. We were going in and out of the ice to collect samples. It was much easier to go from one station to the next station in the open water rather than tracking through the ice. And one of the big questions, and we have to sort out as well, there may have been ice at a location when we sampled there, but was there ice there last week? Because at this time of the year, the ice is moving back and forth depending on the wind direction. We had easterly winds early in the cruise and then northerly winds. And so the ice moved back and forward. And this will have an impact on how much elemental mercury is in the surface water and what happens in the atmosphere above as well. So here finally, I know I've been talking for a while already. Here finally is some data from the cruise. On the top figure is the dissolved mercury concentration in the water measured from the ship as we are underway. On the bottom, just to give you a sense of where we are, is the latitude is plotted as the green line, and then the numbers on the line represent the stations where we stopped and actually collected water column samples. We sampled through the water column. The dotted line here on the right is a sort of representation of when we were in the ice. And if you remember the figure I had shown previously, it seemed like there were higher concentrations of mercury in the previous studies under ice. So here is the first finding that is a little surprising to us, and we're still trying to figure out what's going on. We found higher concentrations early on in the cruise when we were in the open water, although we did encounter some ice flows in the region between stations 3 and 4. But in station 5 under the ice, we had relatively low concentrations, which was a surprise to us. Further on, this is stations 6, 7, and 8, and 9. Station 7 was not in the ice, but stations 6, 8, and 9 were in the ice. And at stations 8 and 9, we did see higher concentrations of elemental mercury under the ice, which is what we expected. And one of the things that I think, and I need to go back, and Steve Roberts, a technician on the ship, has made a movie, and maybe I can show it if we have time later, of how the ice evolved over the time during the cruise, and we can go back and work out whether the stations that we occupied, and maybe they were in open water when we occupied them, maybe they were under the ice previously, and the opposite way around. When we occupied them, they were under the ice. They were in open water previously. So we've got some really excellent data here. We're still trying to figure it all out, of course. Some of this data is only a few days old. but we have so much information, and it's going to really help us understand what's going on in terms of the concentrations. Just to show you vertical profiles at 2 stations, stations 4 and 5, and their locations are shown on the left up above the Bering Strait. We have the elemental mercury concentrations at depth in the water column, and if I go back, sorry, how do I go backwards? The concentrations deeper in the water column are actually higher than they were at the surface, where, you know, with the the collections, that the data that I just showed you. So it seems like we have higher concentrations deeper, and maybe that indicates that some of the mercury had been lost from the surface water to the atmosphere by gas evasion. So going back to the previous work that was done in 2015. This is the data I showed you earlier, but plotted in a different way. The dark blue here is the estimation of the ice cover, and the red is the Hg0 concentration. And you can see here, this was during the cruise between 75 and 80. As the ice cover was increasing, we still had relatively low concentrations of elemental mercury, and it only seems to have built up to a high concentration under the multi-year ice around the North Pole, right? So this may lead us to understand that maybe the formation and these high concentrations of elemental mercury Hg0 under the ice is not something that happened and came to equilibrium very quickly, but it took many years to get to those high concentrations. And that in the seasonal ice, we actually have much lower concentrations on the ice, and maybe it doesn't build up to that extent. So one of the implications of this would be that if we start getting rid of multi-year ice and having much more seasonal ice, we may lose some of these high concentrations, but the amount of mercury that's going to be lost seasonally from the Arctic Ocean to the atmosphere may be less than we would expect if we built up much higher concentrations under the seasonal ice. So that's one of the questions that has been unresolved, and is, you know, we'll have to think hard about it based on the data from this cruise. Finally, just a few more slides. In the atmosphere, this is the measurements again made on the cruise in the atmosphere. So this is the elemental, the Hg0 concentration, typically between 1.2 and 1.4 nanograms per cubic meter. We had some high values here, which I'm not quite sure what they represent, and we still got to figure that out. But you can see here, there was an occasion around May 28th when we had a big decrease in the elemental mercury concentrations, and here plotted is the reactive gaseous mercury as the blue squares, and the aerosol mercury. And so you can see that while we had lower concentrations of the elemental mercury, we had increased concentrations. And again, nothing was happening when we were away from the ice, but as soon as we got in the vicinity of the ice, we had an increase in these concentrations in the atmosphere of these oxidized forms of mercury. And in the second figure, you can see when we were more in the ice, we have very high concentrations of this reactive gaseous mercury. So clearly, the ice that we were in, which had lots of leads in it and was broken up to some degree, we're having lots of mercury chemistry, and we're forming these very high concentrations, which I suspect that when we analyze the surface section of our ice core, we're going to find very high concentrations of mercury in the top sections of core, because we have strong evidence here that it's being formed in the atmosphere right now. And so this is actually the first time that anyone's made these measurements on a ship away from the shore, and on the ice, as far as I know. So this is very exciting to see this data. And if we can compare again, this is the element, the concentration of Hg0 in the atmosphere during the cruise in 2015, which went all the way to the North Pole and came back. And you can see that pretty much the concentration was between 1.2 and 1.4 most of the time. There's some indication here, which was at the ice edge again, of some short depletions in the concentrations. But overall, we didn't see any reactive gaseous mercury. It was all less than 10 picograms per cubic meter, whereas on this cruise, we have concentrations up to 100, so 10 times higher. And then this is a cruise in the Pacific, which started at the Aleutian Islands and went southwards to Tahiti. And again, you can see this is the reactive gaseous mercury concentration. So very low in the where we are right now. We do see that there's the potential of forming them in the tropical environment. We had higher concentrations, but that's from different mechanisms, not associated with ice. But clearly, what we are seeing, we saw right now, while we're up in the ice in the Arctic, is very unusual chemistry going on, and very high concentrations of mercury are being formed and precipitated onto the ocean. So basically, this is just a schematic that I put together to try and bring it together. We're having oxidized mercury, elemental mercury, Hg0, being converted to ionic mercury in association with the ice, right? If the ice is melting, then the mercury is getting into the ocean. The ice is stopping the elemental mercury get back into the atmosphere. Some of the ionic mercury that will be deposited onto the ice will be converted back to Hg0 and evaded into the atmosphere. So there's complex cycling going on at the ice-air interface, but we're putting more ionic mercury into the water, and that likely means that we're producing more methylmercury and getting more. So I think that with less multi-year ice and more seasonal ice, one-year ice, we're going to end up with higher concentrations of mercury getting into the Arctic. And then in the open water scenario, right, we have lots of mercury getting back to the atmosphere. We have less conversion into the ionic mercury, but we have inputs of mercury coming from elsewhere mostly, and not from local production. And we probably also, so I think that overall, and I think this is my final slide, overall, I'm sort of have to reevaluate our assumption we had that we're building up high concentrations of Hg0 under one-year ice, because we didn't seem to see that in the study. And so decreasing sea ice may not have, one of the ideas was that decreasing sea ice would lead to more release of mercury back to the atmosphere. I don't think that is likely, may not likely to be, so that may lead to more mercury. And the changing sea ice conditions may actually enhance the chemistry in the atmosphere in the spring and lead to more mercury getting into. So overall, and of course, climate change, as I said before, thawing permafrost and melting ice and glaciers are all going to put more mercury into the Arctic Ocean. So overall, I think, unfortunately, my sort of assessment at the moment is that climate change is probably going to lead not to a decrease in mercury inputs to the Arctic, but maybe lead to an increase in input of mercury to the Arctic, which is an unfortunate thing. But I think more research, of course, is always needed, and more study. But that seems to be the way I'm leaning right now. And so with that, I'll take any questions.
All right.
Hello,
well,
can
thank
you hear me? This is Lucy.
Hi, Lucy. So, yes, I was getting right to the caller. So go ahead, Lucy. Lucy's in, you're calling from
Thank
Gamble.
you so much. I'm calling from Gamble, yes.
Go ahead.
My question is, since we subsistence hunters and gatherers, and we're on top of the food chain, and this mercury is in the fish and sea mammals, is this posing a threat to our health in any way? Or what is the what does mercury do in a human body?
Mercury can have a effect, and I mean the most important effect, and as I said early on in the talk, it's really the methylmercury that is accumulating in the. So the methylmercury has a large effect on children and the unborn child, and right. So most of the in the US, the EPA has, advisories for the amount of mercury that one should consume, and that is, and that is mostly aimed at pregnant women, but the aim for pregnant women is mostly for the unborn child rather than the woman herself. So the developing fetus and young children are exposed to, can be exposed to high concentrations of methylmercury, and that can be a serious health concern, and it can affect learning and so the main effect is on, because the amount of mercury you can consume relates to your body weight, right? So if the larger you are, the more methylmercury you can consume to have the same impact, right? So children and because it's a neurotoxin, it affects the developing a child much more than, although there are potential effects on adults, they are less. It takes a higher concentration to have an effect on an adult than it does have on a child.
So Lucy brings up a really good question, and thank you, Rob. That's a difficult one to answer. So Lucy brings up a good question that I think everyone in this region will immediately go to, because everyone's eating the fish, the birds in an Arctic environment, the marine mammals. And what, for Lucy and everyone else that's in this region, this is one of those things that gets, it's considered a contaminant. It's why in certain areas you can only eat so many cans of tuna per week and whatnot. So, right. For example, these kinds of heavy metals are tested for in a lot of our marine mammals. We could use a lot more testing, but for example, bowhead is one of the longest lived animals on the planet. Now you would think that a bowhead whale that can live for 200 plus years would over time accumulate a high level, because he's so long lived, and he's eating on the krill, but he's living for 200 years. So you would think. Now the North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management and the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, which you may not know about from being in Connecticut, but they have done studies looking at levels, and they continue to monitor. I don't think every year, and maybe someone here can answer that. I think we do see a hand up. And so the bowhead, for example, is incredibly low in methylmercury, but there are studies. And Lucy, you bring up a good point. The foods of the Bering Strait region should absolutely be monitored for this kind of thing. And it's the sort of absolute question that needs to be taken to the managers. And that would be for seals, whales, that would be, and sea lions, that would be NOAA. And for walrus and for all the polar bear, that's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If they hear that from the public more and more, then they will pay attention to that more and more. So if that helps, know that there's not enough data to really answer that question that you have, absolutely. But know that a lot of the animals for which are super important, They have had some study done, and nothing's right at a any kind of threat level for us. Does it need to be monitored? Absolutely. So I hope
Yeah.
that helps, Lucy.
Yeah, and if I can just add one thing, that there have been studies done, and this is a area of research, that some marine mammals are actually able to detoxify the methylmercury in their livers, right? And so some marine mammals and even some marine birds have been shown to detoxify. And what they actually do is they precipitate the mercury with selenium, which is another element, right? And so they form these granules of mercury selenide in their livers, and so you can actually see that in these but I unfortunately don't know all the details of which marine mammals do that and which birds do and which birds don't, but there is evidence. So one of the active areas of research that has been done is looking at not just the mercury levels in the mammals, but also the selenium levels in the mammals, because if the selenium levels are high enough, there's a potential that there could be a detoxification of the mercury. And I know that is an active area of study, but that's not something that I really focus on. And so that would be something that'd be worth looking into.
So thank you, Lucy. Do you have any other questions on this subject?
No, thank you.
Okay,
No,
and
that's all I'll ask for now.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you.
And in the chat box, which you cannot see because Lucy's calling in, and I can email this presentation at a later time, Lucy, is from the North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management. The wildlife veterinarian wrote, the bowhead eats large quantities of copepod and krill. However, its total mercury values have over time remained extremely low. Similarly, methylmercury is low as well. What are your thoughts? And this may or may not be, Rob, something you can answer here, because we're talking about a bowhead whale, and I think you're in chemistry. The question is, what are your thoughts on the lack of bioaccumulation in such a long-lived species?
Yeah, I mean, because the copepods and the krill are, if you remember that one figure where I showed, so for something eating a fish and something eating a copepod, for each step in the food chain, if you go from your krill or your copepod, which are the zooplankton, to the fish that are eating the zooplankton, right? And so the whales would be there as well, right? You're increasing the concentration by maybe a factor of 10, but then if a fish that eats fish, then that's another factor of 10, right? So even though they are very large organisms, they're feeding very low on the food chain, right? So they in our sort of scientific, so the phytoplankton are the primary producers because they make their own, they photosynthesize, and then the copepods and the krill are the primary consumers because they're eating the plankton, the phytoplankton, and anything that eats the krill is a secondary consumer. And so a whale is lower on the food chain if it's eating krill and copepods than some fish that are eating other fish, right? So you would expect it to have a lower concentration. The other thing that's probably in there as well, it depends on, the methylmercury tends to accumulate in, bind with sulfur, so it accumulates in protein. It doesn't accumulate in the fat like the organic contaminants accumulate in the fat. Methylmercury does not accumulate in the fat, right? So it also depends on where you're making the measurements, of what tissues you're making the measurements in. And I had a discussion with people about this recently, because I'm trying to work with the Mystic Aquarium, and Mystic Connecticut is doing a study looking at collecting samples, and they want to they're going to get biopsy samples of whales, and they were asking me whether I was interested in actually measuring mercury concentration in their biopsy samples to go along with their study. So, and we were talking about whether we should measure in the skin or the blubber. The methylmercury concentrations in the blubber are actually quite low, and they're much higher in the skin. So it depends where you are making the measurements as well.
And in the chat box, I believe the veterinarian for the North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management wrote kidney and liver. So that is why oftentimes for those people that are in the communities that people are asking, oh, if you see anything, if you can get a sample of kidney and liver. Analyzing for these things like mercury is terribly expensive. That's why it wouldn't be a bad idea to keep bringing your voice to the authority, because I think that is especially why I'm grateful to Robert Mason and Sikuliaq for letting him do this right while he's on the ship. But you know, mercury is going to be, there's a big question about what's going to happen, and so we need to be on top of that and monitoring that, so everybody's voice will count. There is another caller, and I'm just gonna go right to the caller and ask if they have a question, because it is really hard to be a caller on a Zoom call. So there is a caller with a 907 number, 886. Do they have a question? And I see 1+7 pro in a minute. I'm just gonna ask if 886, last number's 886, if you have any questions. They've been on the call the entire time. Well done. All right,
Hey,
and
Gay.
1+7, go ahead.
Yeah, this last summer traveling to camp, boy, I guess the permafrost is really melting. There's a lot of on land that goes way down there. And I heard earlier you said that there's mercury in the permafrost.
That
He's
is
shaking his head,
correct.
yes.
One of the things that has come out in the last 10, 15 years about mercury, which is another very unusual thing about it when you think about a metal, is that because it's a gas in the air, it actually can be taken up by plants through their leaves, right? You know, so in the same way the plants are trying to take up CO2 through their stomata, you know, to produce you know, for their photosynthesis, the mercury can actually also cross over the stomata as the Hg0 and then get oxidized within the leaf and then build up in the leaf. So actually most of the mercury accumulating in the terrestrial environment in the Arctic is coming from the air, not from rainfall, but directly from the gas being taken up into the plants. And so there's a high concentration of mercury in the permafrost, because this uptake of the mercury from the air into the plants has been going on forever, right? There was mercury in the air even before humans increased the amount of mercury in the air. There was naturally mercury in the air. So the permafrost has a large reservoir of mercury bound up in it and bound up in the soils, and so and it's kept there because it's frozen. So defrosting the permafrost is going to be, the estimates vary widely between different researchers. As I said, it's not my area of research, but it is a very major concern, and there have been some studies done in the Arctic showing, and with Russian rivers showing that very high concentrations of mercury are potentially in the rivers are associated with permafrost melting.
Orland, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And we do drink water from the rivers. I wonder, should I
Yeah,
Keep
yeah, the
drinking from
concentration
the
of mercury
river,
in the
or should I bring some
Yeah.
water from home too?
the concentration in the water is not enough to be a health concern. The difference in the concentration between the concentration in the water and the concentration in the plankton, the plankton are so good at bioconcentrating the methylmercury that the concentration in the plankton is 1,000,000 times higher than it is in the water. So you can drink the water, you know, unless it's highly contaminated by a specific source of mercury. There's no concern about the water. It's just in the organisms that are, if you're eating the organisms living in the water.
So unless you're in a Superfund site or something like that, or highly
Yeah, unless you're in a
contaminated area,
Superfund
people
site or
shouldn't
something
worry.
like that. Yeah.
People shouldn't worry about their drinking water on the country.
Yeah, you shouldn't worry about in the drinking water. You shouldn't worry about swimming in the water or anything like that. That's not a concern. It's really, it's all through the you know, the seafood and the marine mammals and, you know, and birds, right?
Thank you. And so that's really helpful for us
Thank
to
you.
hear. Anything else, Orlin? I think that's you.
No, that was it, I believe.
All right. Thanks for
Thanks.
joining in. Go ahead, 886, another caller. Did you have a question? You came on line for a sec. I can see you from here.
Hi,
You're-
Gabe. This is Erica.
Hi.
That's my number. I don't have any questions.
Oh, okay. Somehow it lit up pretty good. Sorry to bother. All right. I know I have a question. Does anyone have questions in the chat box?
I think we
Hi.
answered most of them.
Oh, I've got some myself because I was interested in your polar bear map. You had the view from above. And you said that a lot of the input is from Russian rivers, huh? Of the mercury. But the bear hair in your study showed that Russia and Bering Strait and the entire Russia-Siberian coast, those bears weren't the ones that were in the red or the yellow. That was in Canada, central Canada. It looked like central high Arctic Canada.
Yeah.
Thoughts on?
I think it's, I mean, I think it's because of the difference in the, I mean, you know, there's a lot more land-sea interface, right, in the Canadian Arctic, right? It's much, you know, much more broken up and that. And I think that one of the things that I didn't really talk about, I should have mentioned, is that in shallower environments, the methylmercury can be formed in the sediment. The microbial activity in the sediment can form the methylmercury, and then the methylmercury can come out of the sediment into the water column. And so I think that in the Arctic, Canadian Arctic, there's much more production. There may be less mercury coming in, but there's much more of that mercury is getting converted into methylmercury because of there's a lot more land water interface, right? Because of the archipelago, right? You know, so, and it's not open water like it is in the other parts of the Arctic, right?
Thank you. And we also have Dean Stockwell with his hand up. He's patiently been waiting to ask his question. Go ahead, Dean.
Hi, Rob. I think you're on a great ship with a fantastic crew, and I hope you enjoyed that because it's a great experience.
No, it's been wonderful. Yeah.
Yep. So my question is,
I haven't eaten so well in a long time.
there you go. Your slide along the Aleutians really intrigued me. You showed high concentrations of methylmercury at depth. And then you turned around and you said you had high concentrations in the phytoplankton near the surface. So my question, is this source water deep Bering Sea water or North Pacific water that you're seeing that deep concentration? And would you think that it would be an upwelling event that would bring it to the surface?
Yeah, well, I need to talk to my physical oceanographer friends, but you know, when we were coming through yesterday, I mean, we had strong westerly winds blowing along the islands, right? And when we were there, and the first thing that came into my head was that it would, because you know, we were 500 meters of water, but we were very close to the shelf, you know, edge. And I wondered if it was we were getting the high concentration through upwelling event, and that seemed to me to be the most logical explanation for what we were seeing. But again, I'd have to talk to my colleagues about that. I think that it's deep water coming from the Bering and being upwelled at the islands that is providing the source. That's my guess, but I don't have the proof at the moment.
Looking forward to seeing those results.
Yeah, thanks.
And actually, I had another question, and that was, you had mentioned also when you finally hit the ice, you were expecting to have high methylmercury, is that right? But you had low.
Or we're expecting to find high concentrations of Hg0 of the elemental mercury under the ice, and it was lower than we expected. Yeah.
But you saw it before as you were coming up to the south. Could that be because you were up in the Chukchi? We have had a very fast melt out here in the northern Bering Sea, Bering Strait region, and there's as you know, there's a massive current taking that. Is that our is that our mercury that's been blown north? You know, that's as melt.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that I didn't have because it wasn't on any of those slides, but a couple of days ago we went past. You know, we were coming down and we passed the Yukon, you know, where the Yukon River comes out, right? And we actually went through an area of low salinity. We could see low salinity in the water that we were sampling, and the elemental mercury concentration went up. So we have direct evidence that, you know, I didn't show that today because I hadn't plotted it up, but we have evidence that there was definitely inputs coming in from the terrestrial environment. And I think that, and one of the things too is that if you have lots of phytoplankton bloom, that biology can also produce higher concentrations of the elemental mercury. And we had some very high, we passed through some water that had chlorophyll A concentrations that we rarely see in temperate environments. We were all quite surprised how high the primary productivity was, and I think that was just right in that region where we saw the high concentrations. So I think it's related to terrestrial inputs and high productivity.
Thank you.
And you know, one of the things that again, we have so much data to look at, it's hard to get through it all already. But at the ice edge, often at the ice edge as well, you see high concentrations of chlorophyll. So, you know, when the ice is starting to recede, then you're getting mixing and lots of nutrients coming up to the surface, and you have lots of productivity. So I think that's what happened in the Bering where we were. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And if you can stand just a question or two more, Dean Stockwell's got his hand raised again for you.
Yeah, sure.
If that was the case, you should be seeing an increase in concentration at the bottom of the ice where you have all of that ice algae. Because that concentration of algae is a lot thicker than what you're going to see in the water column.
Yeah, and you know, when we went into when we go into the ice, we should have seen the higher concentrations, and I agree with you. It was a surprise, and we expected, yes, with the algae under the ice, we should see higher, that could contribute to the higher concentration. So, it's a debate that's not just related to the Arctic, but it's related to all the other studies we've done in other oceans. You know, how much does the elemental, the Hg0 concentration relate to primary productivity? How much is it related to sources, right? And sometimes those things are so well, both are happening at the same time. It's hard to parse one out or the other. And, hopefully we will be able to sort those two questions out with all the data we have from this cruise. Is the amount of mercury coming in, right? You can assume that if you're putting more mercury into the system, you're going to get more Hg0. Is it just more mercury coming in, or does the biology also matter? And that is definitely a question that is not completely answered at this point.
So thank you very much, Rob, and
Yep.
Dean, I hope that got at your question. Before we sign off, I have one more question, but before we do, I'm a little off my game because we're talking live from the ship, so that's really exciting for me. And we always try to put a little love for the speaker in the chat column because it is not easy. And I don't know what the ship time is right now, but Rob Mason is doing above and beyond. He's actually rocking and rolling on this vessel past the Shumagan Islands in the northern Gulf of Alaska, giving us a lecture on an educational moment on methylmercury, which is a super important, it really is a very important topic for the Bering Strait region because of our large number of healthy animals, but also the concern that this may be something that another thing we might have to A, think about, and B, certainly we might be able to start getting answers if we can verbalize these questions to our wildlife marine resource managers like NOAA and Fish and Wildlife, what we're worried about, the contaminants, that kind of thing. So thank you so much, Robert. And let's see.
Pleasure.
My last question is, given that this is the first time that we've been able to do this with the ship, and we're all big Sikuliaq fans out here, and B, you bring this important topic to us as a first, because it looks like you're the first one actually doing a lot of this research in this novel area of the Arctic. When are you coming back?
As soon as I can.
Okay, well, we want to hear it when you come back. We really do.
Yeah.
Because this is a topic that
I will have to write a proposal and get funded to come back. And we both for, the work we did. And I was talking to my colleagues who, the data I showed from around the Aleutian Islands, and they really want to come back too. So I think
Wonderful.
we'll be back because there's so many unanswered questions and so much more to know.
And maybe if we can get some monitoring going from on the marine resources like the fish, the krill, the birds, the walrus.
Yeah, no, I mean,
is
yeah,
that something that then
I mean,
helps you? Do those informations help you?
And I'll just say, getting the samples to us is probably the hardest part. But if anyone wanted to get samples to us, we would be happy to analyze them.